Hello, my dear viewers. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of personality. Today, I would like to talk with you about dissociation and projections. When a person hears the term dissociative disorder, they imagine something terrible, something about multiple personalities, like Billy Milligan, and it is perceived as a psychiatric diagnosis. But in reality, each of us dissociates from time to time. Let's try to understand what exactly this involves. As soon as you start thinking over a situation and another person appears in your mind with whom you begin to have a conversation, try to prove something to them, or even punish them, this indicates that dissociation has already occurred. In other words, that part of yourself, the aspect of your personality, thoughts, or feelings that you find difficult or even impossible to integrate into your conscious identity, or that you simply cannot accept as truly belonging to you, you tend to dissociate from your awareness. So, in our consciousness, the appearance of another person with whom we are conversing indicates that some kind of unbearable tension is occurring. Because of this unbearable tension, we dissociate from it and, in fact, from our real self and escape into some unreal image. That was the theory. Now, let's look at it in practice. I think each of you can recall a moment when you found yourself in a conflict with someone. And even after the conflict has ended, the dialogue with that person keeps going on and on in your mind. This suggests that the person is unable to claim their own anger as their own. In other words, they don't see it as them being angry or attacking someone else, but rather as standing up for themselves, as defending themselves. So this anger is experienced internally as a kind of righteous indignation. And the image of the other person as bad allows one to, in effect, completely and thoroughly cloak their own aggression in the white robes of righteousness. At that moment, the person does not perceive themselves as being aggressive. In the same way, they do not perceive themselves as aggressive at all, even while being in the middle of the conflict. That is, it seems to them that they are simply defending themselves. And this is not aggression, it is self-defense. I am not saying that you shouldn't defend yourself. You should. But I am talking about being honest with yourself. Because this kind of dissociation, this kind of denial has many consequences. So if I say, I was not aggressive, and in my mind right now I am not aggressive, I am defending myself from the attacks of an already imagined object, then in this way I am not whole. That is, when we talk about dissociation, we are talking about the loss of wholeness. The personality was once uniform, whole, and at some point, for some reason, it's split into separate parts. Some specialists recommend dividing yourself into components. They say, this is my inner child. They suggest, pity this child, help them grow, nurture them. In other words, the aspects one associates with the inner child are not integrated as their own. Or, for example, this is my ideal self. It attacks me, it is dissatisfied with me. So once again, it's not that I am dissatisfied with myself, but rather that some ideal self, a punitive superego, a parental figure, it doesn't matter, feels this way. As soon as the personality becomes fragmented, a person no longer perceives what they are interacting with as a part of themselves. This part is rejected. And in moments of this rejection, a person's consciousness alternates, sometimes identifying with the punishing figure, and at other times with the one being punished. In these situations, this alternation can be quite pronounced. You see, I am still one person, one personality, but in moments of self-dissatisfaction, I take the side of the one who is dissatisfied with myself. I associate myself with a kind of better version of myself, one who knows how things should have been done, who could have acted differently, and who is now going to teach this failure how things should have been done correctly. And in fact, The main dissociation of personality is the splitting into the real self, which becomes the object of all that is bad. By analogy, as we discussed earlier, when there is someone else in our mind, another figure appears. So a container for all that is bad appears my real self, and then there is the better self. In general terms, what we dissociate from are the bad aspects, those parts we label as wrong or bad, and from vulnerability. These are the two main points, badness and vulnerability. Badness is the sense of, I won't survive. This is a threat to my safety. Vulnerability is like a wounded animal, an injured creature that also will not survive. We dissociate from both badness and vulnerability. That is, when we make a mistake and feel burning shame, in that moment we are already attacking and punishing ourselves. We are dissatisfied with ourselves. We have already dissociated from our imperfect mistake-making selves and quickly shifted into the position of someone who knows better. How could it be I make a mistake and I stay in that part of myself without rushing to escape into the ideal self, the one that is always dissatisfied, that punishes, that lectures and corrects? I try to understand what happened, why this mistake occurred. In other words, I don't leap into my ideal I. When specialists advise us to feel sorry for ourselves, to support ourselves in that moment, again, it's from this ideal self. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do this. I want to draw your attention to the habit of this kind of dissociation. There are practices, for example, where a certain part of the personality sits on a chair and you talk to it. This is a forced dissociation. One of my clients, after seating one of her parts on a chair like this, then experienced significant anxiety. She was afraid she couldn't pull herself together. This feeling of not existing is precisely what happens when we leap out of our real self. On the one hand, this mechanism helps us cope with certain stresses. We jump out as if canceling what's happening to us, wait until the emotions settle down a bit, and only then return to ourselves. It's pointless to say that we shouldn't do this. There is always a limit to what we can endure. And when it becomes unbearable for the personality, it escapes from the real self, which is the one experiencing it. Saying don't do this or do this less is pointless because it happens entirely on reflex, automatically. The only thing we can do is to recognize what is happening to us right now. We've escaped from our real self because these experiences feel unbearable. And that's when this inner dialogue arises, lecturing, punishing, pitying, and so on and so forth. It's as if I'm addressing myself from some kind of cloud. This act of jumping out of my real self brings a lot of perks. For example, I can fantasize about myself, about my future, about what I want, completely ignoring the actual state of things and my real capability. I can fantasize about being a famous actress. I imagine myself acting in some film, and by stepping out of my real self, I skip over any actual acting training. There's no stage where I play supporting roles. I'm immediately cast in the lead role, instantly famous worldwide, and I get invited to Hollywood. You see, it's enough just to escape from the real self. Or, by escaping from my real self, I can reshape the past, imagining how I could have acted differently and how my fate would be different now. In other words, escaping from the real self allows us to play God, to invent events, to create our own reality, to come up with a new identity for ourselves. But returning to the real self, for people who are used to living in the idealized version, is accompanied by a sense of inadequacy. Of course, it does seem miserable compared to that imagined, brilliant personality who never makes mistakes, always gets everything done, only needs 4 hours of sleep, and can eat enormous amounts without gaining weight. And the real self always seems, just not quite right, not quite enough. When we talk about projections, we are specifically referring to the projection of dissociated parts. In other words, to put it simply, a person projects either their real self, which they see as inferior, or their ideal self. If we were to conduct a sociological study, we would find that people are constantly in the position of, I am better than others. There is always a reason to devalue someone else, to find their flaws, to assert oneself, and so on and so forth. In other words, a person who is in survival mode, who is fixated on themselves, is always judging and constantly devaluing others. There may also be moments when a person devalues themselves. This indicates that their ideal self is projected onto someone else. Most often, we project our ideal self onto teachers, certain bloggers we admire, or personalities we look up to. And by dissociating ourselves from our ideal self, sending it to live in another person, we end up feeling quite small. That is why when we are around people onto whom we have projected our ideal self, we constantly feel this smallness. In this feeling of smallness, you can begin to understand the kind of relationship you have within your own personality, what happens when you scold yourself, when you punish yourself, this sense of smallness and the looming threat of punishment. This ideal self has been projected onto someone else. It is what triggers this feeling of smallness, and it is what creates the urge to grovel, to please, to flirt, to make yourself feel lesser. This indicates that you have been left without your ideal self. You have been left without that part of yourself, which, of your own accord, you projected onto another person. And then, interesting dynamics begin to unfold with those who are seen as carriers of the ideal self. On one hand, they are admired and even idolized. But on the other, they're also resented, and people look for their flaws. There is great satisfaction when they finally make a mistake. It feels as if you are freed from their power. You can devalue them and move on with your life, looking for someone else onto whom you can project your ideal self next time. So when we understand these mechanisms, we begin to understand what is happening to us. They start to be managed by us. In other words, these dissociations and projections in someone who's unaware of them tend to unfold automatically, without any conscious control. As soon as you bring this into your awareness, the automatic nature of it disappears. You understand what you are doing and you immediately stop doing it. It might not work perfectly at first, but gradually this skill will develop. This mechanism, this dissociation, this tendency to reject what we don't like, also depends on the breadth of one's worldview. For people with a more primitive mindset, who see things strictly as right or wrong, black or white, good or bad, there will be a lot of badness in their perception. Anything that is not perfect will be considered bad. And that's why they tend to lose themselves over any little thing. A person who has lost touch with themselves will feel as if they don't exist. They won't truly be. They won't truly live this life, because it is the real self that lives. The ideal self, on the other hand, is always lost in dreams and fantasies, and it never truly aligns with reality. So the ability to endure your real self, the ability to experience emotions without excess, this is important. There are many videos about this topic. The ability to remain yourself, no matter what happens. It's like having a friend with whom, no matter what happens, you have made a decision to stay together. It's exactly the same with yourself. Make the decision to be yourself. And then transformation and growth of your real self will begin to take place. That is when you will experience wholeness, and the feeling that you don't exist will diminish. There will be fewer idols, but there will also be fewer people you consider yourself better than. Everything will fall into place. I would like to kindly ask you to write in the comments, please. Of course, it's easier to describe when you projected your ideal self onto idols. But try to write about when you projected your real self, your vulnerability, your flaws onto others. And then you took it back. And just a reminder, new videos are published on this channel twice a week, so feel free to subscribe. Join us here and explore the ebook that's now available. If you'd like to learn more, it's available in English. You can order it on the website. I'm saying goodbye to you now. See you soon. All the best.